own hand speak. That is what is recorded in the history. The whole year the Kawaka just make one beer that is made white man. The whole year. I mean, Skit didn't have a shower. He was coming all the way from the coast. The only thing we knew yesterday, the whole Kawaka of Uganda, was that he met this one lonely, lost wife. How is that possible? How is it possible? Then they teach us in primary school. Stanley passed Karagwe, he met Manika, he went to Mbarara, he's a slave. He was like 15. But because my life was the Bible and the survival of our people depended on me, I had to biology, I had to go into genetics, I had to go into mathematics to try and understand it, not only understand it, understand it, so that they can explain it to someone. When I understand it, going under the table, I want to stand top. So, when I'm ready to go, I'm not going to leave no stone unturned and turn every stone twice.
Your ancestors in the world that you created were able, with very little knowledge, they didn't know the European, they didn't study the Middle Nature, Shakespeare did not know about Ra, Sandra did not go to school, to learn philosophy, to learn military strategy, to learn whatever, yet in most of the time they outfought, outgeneraled, outfronted some of the best military genius that Europe had ever possessed. Do that at the time. If they were able to do that at the time, what about you? Who's got a phone? Who's got a fax? You don't only have a phone, you have a fax and a mobile phone.
Every 5 seconds, a child is dying of malaria in Africa. Now, to get the dose of life-saving anti-malaria is about $5. But there is no government to give anti-malaria. When somebody gets malaria, if they have no money, they get ill and die. So the question that I was asking and many people were asking was, if you really want to help children, why begin with a disease that they don't have? Why not go Why not look for something that is killing them? This is Oxford, Cambridge, where you go to get this degree, where you get the first degree, which is a BA, bachelor's degree. You know, they don't believe in marriage. So they don't, the only thing they can give you is a bachelor's degree. Because you can stumble on a conference like this and get shocked when a few ideas are thrown in your head. I don't believe what Nana Sekmet said. I don't believe that kind of stuff. It's okay. They teach you how to critique, not to believe anything. When they say, they say, what do you think about black people building their own institutions? You say, well, it has its own advantages and disadvantages. The high culture of Egyptian civilization that starts around the Nile Valley eventually ends up here in the Giza Plateau, in the pyramids of Giza, one of the highest high technical civilizations that African people put together, starting all the way from Uganda, covering present-day Sudan, and going up here in Egypt. established that more than 7 million years ago, a black woman stretched forth her hands under God and gave us the first human being. In the beginning was a black woman. This black woman lived at the foothills of the mountains of the moon. This black woman lived in the Iraqustan region known in ancient time as the land of the gods. This black woman lived at the source of the Nile. This black woman lived between the two domes of the Great Rift Valley. This black woman's genes run through the genes of every human being. This black woman's DNA is the string that connects every person that walks on earth. That is why we say that let him that is worthy be worthy still, and let him that is righteous be righteous still. So behold, I come quickly. My reward is with me to give unto every man and woman for and according to his reward should be. For in the beginning was a black woman. This woman gave rise to a human. Never was a time when a black woman was not. Never will be time when black people will cease to be, because we are eternal, my brothers and sisters. Brothers and sisters, this is a great opportunity. It is a great opportunity for you to be able to sit in your living room and watch the Battle of Adwa. It is a great opportunity for you to sit in your living room and watch the pain and suffering that African people went through the African Holocaust.
What shall be done with the 4 million slaves if they are emancipated? This question has been answered and can be answered in many ways. Primarily, it is a question less for man than for God, less for human intellect than for the laws of nature to solve. Our answer is, do nothing with them. Mind your business and let them mind theirs. Your doing with them is their greatest misfortune. They have been undone by your doings, and all they now ask and really have need of at your hands is just to let them alone. Frederick Douglass, 1862.
It is the stupidity of man to think that he can do evil, even some monstrous evil, and it won't have any backlash on himself. But of course, it seldom works that way, and the moment he figures that out, he starts looking for a way to avoid the repercussions of what he's done. This is what happened with slavery. In the early 1800s, as it began to look like the end of slavery might be on the horizon, white America started to be concerned that a day of reckoning was coming. The primary fear for the average person was of retribution and insurrection, and that was a reasonable fear. After all, it's illogical to think that you can do to a whole group of people what was done to African Americans and think that they will just take it lying down forever. And of course there were things like the Nat Turner uprisings. But for the wealthy elite, their fears went beyond things like insurrection. They were worried about the financial impact. Remember, it was not just the cotton plantations that profited from slavery. Whether you're talking about the banks or the insurance companies, the railroads, even the newspapers, the fact is that almost every aspect of the American economy was at some level or another invested in the slave business. You also need to recognize that for the wealthy elitists who controlled this system, slaves were an asset as long as they were slaves. But at the moment they are set free, they become a liability. And what the elite knew was that the end of slavery would instantly release 4 million people into the economy who had been kept uneducated and effectively unemployable anywhere but the cotton field. And what they were concerned about was that this was going to bankrupt the American economy. Taxes were going to go through the roof to take care of these people. Crime was going to be rampant. The prisons were going to be flooded. There was going to be this population overrun. And in the North, the biggest fear was migration from the South of these black people. The other fear that these people had was intermarriage between blacks and whites would lead to a loss of racial purity. The question was, what were they going to do about it? And their initial thought was that they would just send all the slaves back to Africa. This plan was called colonization, and it had broad support among the wealthy elite. In fact, the American Colonization Society was even funded by the United States Congress. But in the end, colonization proved to be unworkable, and the idea was eventually scrapped. But about that same time, a new philosophy was emerging in the world. It was called eugenics, and for some, it seemed like the perfect solution to what had become known as the Negro dilemma.
Australian and the Gorilla. Charles Darwin, 1890.
Charles Darwin is very well known for writing The Origin of Species in the 1800s. This book gave rise to evolutionary theory. What people don't know is that there was actually a longer original title to this book, and that was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, copies and editions that they made afterwards eliminated that phrase about the favored races. Evidently, they understood then that it was politically incorrect.
Some may defend Francis Galton because eventually that he rejected slavery, but they do point out that all of his wealth did derive from the slave trade, but also it needs to be known that he, as well as other eugenists, did not reject slavery until after it had ended, and they could not any longer exploit blacks legally. So at that point, it would have been quite easy for he and his cohorts to reject slavery. I think this is a point that we all have to really realize, that the eugenics movement was not invented by the everyday average white American, but by a select group of wealthy white elitists that had often used this ideology to pit all of white America against black America. And so we see that indeed that truly is the case even to this day.
Average Negroes possess too little intellect, self-reliance, and self-control to make it possible for them to sustain the burden of any respectable form of civilization without a large measure of external guidance and support. Francis Galton, 1873.
Eugenicists believed that Africans were inferior not just mentally but physically, and that left to themselves, left alone, they would not make it. The problem is, it didn't work. With that failure, the eugenicists moved on to what is known as positive eugenics. In positive eugenics, the eugenicists wanted the white population to reproduce, to have so many children that it overwhelmed the black population. But that didn't work either. Next, they moved on to what they called negative eugenics. They knew that they could not round up all the blacks in the nation and execute them, so they decided to create an environment where they would convince the blacks to severely limit the number of children they were going to have, and thereby commit race suicide.
The problem of the socially fit must be treated not as one of color, but as a problem of the spread of feeble-mindedness. Dr. Charles Davenport, 1913, director of the Eugenics Record Office, Cold Spring Harbor, New York, and co-founder of the American Eugenics Society.
Eugenics realized that they could not promote their agenda simply because they knew it would be viewed as politically incorrect and socially unacceptable. So what they did was use code words that were once successful in slavery, terms such as feeble-minded, unfit, words such as imbecile, immoral, criminal. They tagged those labels upon the targeted community. These words were less inflammatory, so it lets society more or less not be totally alarmed of the original intent, but deep down inside, I believe everyone truly knew what segment of society and what people they were actually talking about.
Even a cursory glance at the charts, photographs, and diagrams used to popularize eugenic ideals reveals that the unfit were swarthy, black, and ugly by Anglo-Saxon standards, with flattened noses, wiry hair, and prognathous profiles. Harriet Washington, author, Medical Apartheid.
In the early 20th century, the white elitists who made up the eugenics movement were no longer just philosophers and academics. Now they were industrialists and billionaires who had come to embrace a worldview that was essentially identical to the eugenics movement. The same individuals and corporations who had once made millions on the backs of slaves were now willing to spend millions to get rid of them. But that didn't mean that these guys were interested in being public crusaders for the eugenics movement. They were certainly willing to be the brains and the money behind it, but they would hire crusaders to do the dirty work. And the primary one they settled upon was a woman named Margaret Sanger. She was the founder of the American Birth Control League and the publisher of its newsletter, the Birth Control Review. On a practical level, the relationship between Sanger and these elitists was basically a marriage of convenience. In order to advance their common agendas, they needed a front man and she needed money. And the whole thing would be held together by this kind of bizarre obsession with race and class. The result was that the American Birth Control League became the driving force behind the American eugenics movement. Eugenics would no longer just be a philosophy. Sanger and others like her were going to put it into practice.
We are paying for and even submitting to the dictates of an ever-increasing, unceasingly spawning class of human beings who never should have been born at all. Margaret Sanger, 1922.
The laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit, and human life is valuable only when it is of use to the community or race. Madison Grant, 1916, co-founder, American Eugenics Society.
The black man has never been a competitor, but has always been subservient to the white race. And just so long as he remains subservient, his position is secure. And just so soon as he becomes a competitor, his fate is sealed. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, eugenics.
Unquestionably used to target the poor simply because what the quality of life at its core meaning was that poor people really didn't have a reason to live. Only the white, those with status, had any chance of a meaningful or purposeful life. The solution for the poor now was not to eliminate the circumstances that would cause poverty. Their solution now was to eliminate the poor, eliminate the impoverished, and just wipe them off the face of the earth.
The practice of birth control among the majority of colored people would probably be more eugenic than among their white compatriots. The dissemination of the information of birth control should have begun with this class, rather than with the upper social and economic classes of white citizens. Walter Turpening, Birth Control Review, 1932.
In virtually every community where Negroes dwell, one finds them in fat times and lean alike, contributing a disproportionate number to the roles of the dependents and delinquents. They make excessive demands on the white man's charity and overtax his patients. Newell Sims, Birth Control Review, 1932.
Author Madison Grant was a co-founder of the American Eugenics Society and an officer of the New York Zoological Society. In 1906, he had authorized an exhibit at the Bronx Zoo in which a 22-year-old African named Ota Benga was displayed in a cage in the monkey house. Sharing the cage with Benga was an orangutan.
When a local clergyman protested the exhibit, he said that it was clearly intended to be a demonstration of Darwin's theory of evolution. Local proponents of Darwinism apparently agreed and labeled the display educational. 10 years after this event, Ota Benga committed suicide.
During Hitler's regime, the Germans were supplied with elaborate charts and complicated theses supposedly proving the superiority of the German people. It is interesting to note that at the bottom of these charts were the colored people of the world, most conspicuously, the black people. Floyd McKissick, National Director, Congress of Racial Equality, 1967.
An often overlooked fact about the German Holocaust is that the Nazis did not simply target the Jewish population. They went after the black community as well. Under the threat of being sent to concentration camps if they did not cooperate, Afro-German citizens were not only forced to undergo sterilization themselves, they were also required to turn over their children for sterilization. In his book Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler explained the motivation behind such programs.
The Jews were responsible for bringing Negroes into the Rhineland. It suits the purpose of the cool, calculating Jew who would use this means of introducing a process of bastardization in the very center of the European continent, and, by infecting the white race with the blood of an inferior stock, would destroy the foundations of its independent existence. Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf.
The Nazi attitude toward blacks was clearly defined in a 1944 book by Robert Ley, who was the head of the German Labor Front. Ley characterized the Jewish race as a disease-riddled parasite that had been created by unnatural inbreeding between white men and the racially inferior Negro. He described the result as a racial swamp that would eventually destroy the natural superiority of the Aryan race. Another Nazi publication described blacks as African brutes who had not been tamed even by centuries of slavery. It went on to say that any effort to assimilate people of African descent into civilized society was a waste of time, and that the lynchings of blacks in America did not merit any regret.
Well above the various colored races. Lothrop Stoddard, Director, American Birth Control League.
To eliminate blacks from Germany, one of the people Hitler called on was a eugenicist who had once written that blacks are an inferior race of savages who should only be allowed to survive as long as they are of use to the Aryan race. His name was Eugen Fischer, and about 20 years earlier, he had been one of the leaders of a system of concentration camps in southwestern Africa, where blacks were rounded up to be executed, experimented on, or held as free labor. Under Hitler, Fischer would serve on committees that planned the sterilization of all blacks in countries that came under German control. He would also be one of the first Nazi scientists to become publicly affiliated with the Carnegie-funded eugenics laboratory in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. Eventually, Fischer would also be put in charge of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. It was here that many of the Nazi programs for creating racial purity were developed.
In 1927, Margaret Sanger organized the World Population Conference in Geneva, Switzerland, and gave it front-page coverage in her Birth Control Review. The events program shows that several of its attendees were colleagues of Sanger's from the American eugenics movement. It also documents that among those who were given a leadership role in the conference was Eugen Fischer, the man who would eventually lead the Nazi effort to eradicate blacks from Europe.
Another American eugenicist with Nazi connections was Harry Laughlin. Now, he was an official with both the American Eugenics Society and the American Birth Control League, and in 1928 his plan for using forced sterilization to eliminate those who might produce what he called degenerate offspring was published in the Birth Control Review. In 1936, Laughlin led an effort to distribute the English language version of a Nazi eugenics film to audiences in the northeastern part of the United States. He had acquired the rights to the film from the Race Policy Office of the Nazi Party and, with the help of 2 other American eugenics organizations, had mailed literature to biology teachers at 3,000 U.S. high schools, urging them to show it in their classrooms. Later that year, Laughlin was praised in a Nazi newspaper and awarded an honorary degree from the University of Heidelberg for his contributions to the Nazi eugenics effort.
In the 1930s, a German psychiatrist named Ernst Rudin was named president of the International Federation of Eugenics in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, which was funded by the Carnegie Corporation. And in 1933, his call for racial purity was published in the Birth Control Review.
Later, Rudin would be chosen by Hitler to write Germany's eugenics laws, and at one point, he personally helped the Gestapo round up and sterilize several hundred blacks, who they referred to as Rhineland bastards. After the war, Rudin would be identified as one of the architects of the barbaric medical experiments that the Nazis carried out in their concentration camps.
It may be possible that Hitler actually got the idea for concentration camps while studying the American eugenics movement. In 1919, the state of Indiana had allocated $300,000 to create a work colony in the city of Butlerville, where those who were labeled feeble-minded would be incarcerated. Then in 1932, Margaret Sanger called for the United States government to set aside farms and open spaces where certain groups of people would be segregated from the rest of society. She proposed that, among others, the illiterate, the unemployed, and the poor should be forcibly kept in these areas until they developed what she called better moral conduct.
It was later discovered that under the Indiana program, the state was allowed to label someone feeble-minded if they were poor or did not do well in school, or if the state considered them to be shiftless or have insufficient moral judgment. But it's important to understand that this Indiana campaign was not unlike those in other states. For example, a eugenics project conducted in Massachusetts during the late 1920s proposed sterilization for young girls who were diagnosed as defective, which could include being unwed and pregnant, financially poor, or if the state labeled them socially undesirable. In addition, boys as young as 14 could be castrated for showing signs of kleptomania or for exhibiting what was described as solitary behavior.
In a single incident during 1935, the Nazis sterilized the children of over 600 German women because it was reported that those children had been fathered by black men.
When news of this reached the United States, a member of the American Eugenics Society named Walter Ashby Plecker wrote a letter to the German Bureau of Human Betterment and Eugenics, praising them for the action and expressing his hope that not one child had been missed. 10 years earlier, Plecker had written that the black population was the greatest problem and most destructive force which confronts the white race and American civilization.
Eugenics goals are most likely attained under a name other than eugenics. Frederick Osborne, president and founding member of the American Eugenics Society.
And we have spared no expense. We've gone at great length. You have seen, and soon you will see, how we have traveled on all when we tell you about the Piltdown, how white people wanted to falsify the origin of humanity. We go and stand at where they did it and say this is the Piltdown pit in Surrey, England. Now here in the Piltdown Grove, in 1912, in the Piltdown Grove, in front of me is Manor House Farm, and you know the whole of this, of course, is Manor House Farm, but it is a Manor House. Today, Manor House has been bought by a private person, but before, the whole of this used to be a vineyard. And it was here that Charles Dawson, who was a solicitor, who also worked for a couple of guest houses, discovered the Piltdown man. The Piltdown was discovered here, and Piltdown was, at first it was actually the home of the Angles and the Saxons. The Angles and the Saxons lived here. Before the Angles and the Saxons were Romans, and before the Romans, were Celts, and before the Celts, the Swanscombe. Now, the Angles and the Saxons, they called this area the Sud Saxona land. Sud Saxona land. And this Sud Saxona land later became the South Saxon land. And a man called Plessier, he purchased a dune or a hill, and he called it Plessier's dune or Piltdown man, which later became Piltdown man. And here at the Piltdown man, in a gravel not very far away from me, was discovered fossils, which at the time were believed to be the oldest fossil of the Homo sapiens sapien to populate England and to populate Europe. It showed that there was no other people that populated this area other than white people before the African Cro-Magnon that lived in this area 40,000 years ago. Now, for 40 years, the discovery or the scarab or the Piltdown fossil had taken about 8 years to put together. It was, of course, a forgery. And for 40 years, it misled the scientific world. The Piltdown stood ahead in the whole of man in America's Museum of Natural History. It was glorified in the British Museum of Natural History. It was reviewed by the New York Times. It made headline news in New York Times, in the Manchester Evening News, thousands of journals, periodicals, and books. But alas, in 1953, the Piltdown was proven to be a hoax. Thomas P. Oakley, who carried the test, assisted by WAHENE from Oxford Museum, proved beyond reasonable doubt that the Piltdown man had been a hoax. And in proving the hoax of the Piltdown, Oakley and WAHENE destroyed the theory of presapiens in Europe, or the existence of Homo sapiens sapien before the African Gromordi that populated these lands 40,000 years ago. So the theory of anybody existing in Europe before the African Gromordi 40,000 years ago was destroyed here where I am standing in Buckham Manor. The Out River runs not very far from where I am. All this used to be a vineyard, and here a priest called Pierre de Chardin, Sir Arthur Woodward, who was knighted by the Queen for the discovery in 1925. Of course, Charles Dawson, who was a lawyer, from the little town of Oakfield, discovered the Piltdown man, and for 2 years, spread the whole news to the waiting world. You have to remember that there was a reason why Europeans were so anxious to discover the Piltdown man at this location. Of course, there was the whole idea of white supremacy. White people wanted to prove that white people existed before everybody else, and if they couldn't find that they existed before everybody else, then they'd have to make it up.
When we tell you about the slave market in Zanzibar, we go to the slave market and say, this is where it was done, and this is how it was masked.
I'm standing outside the former slave market in Zanzibar, which not long ago would have been bustling full of African people taken from the interior of Africa, held here into this market by Arabs and Europeans, and then sold into different parts of the world. If this place had seen a lot of white people die here, it would be one of the most sacred places in the world. And obviously, I would not even be allowed to stand here or to wear shoes. But not very far away from where I'm standing is a garage. On the right is a hostel. Behind me is a restaurant and a market. The slave memorial has been reduced to 2 dungeons because the church that bought this whole area turned it first into a hospital
and afterwards, when they wanted to make some money, they made it into a hostel. But for African people, the Zanzibar trade market or slave trade memorial will remain one of the most sacred establishments. And of course, from here, as a historian, I can make an appeal to the Zanzibar government, to the African Union, to preserve this place and for posterity and for our history and culture. When we tell you about the door of no return in Senegal, we stand at the door of no return in Senegal. When we tell you about the door of no return in Ghana, at Ermina, we stand at Ermina and show you. When we talk about the pyramid, we don't talk about it, we show you the pyramid, because television is don't tell me, show me. The high culture of Egyptian civilization that starts around the Nile Valley eventually ends up here, in the Giza Plateau, in the pyramids of Giza, one of the highest high technical civilizations that African people put together. Starting all the way from Uganda, covering present-day Sudan, and going up here in Egypt. This pyramid that you see at the back of me was built by the pharaoh Khufu about 2560 BC. The pyramid itself covers an area of 14 square acres. It was built with 2,300,000 blocks, each block weighing 3 tons. The block at the apex and those at the base weigh 50 tons. The stones that were used to build this great pyramid are enough to build a wall of 3 meters high around the whole continent, around the whole country of France. So when the French explorers first came here to the pyramids, they were so amazed of the architecture that went into these pyramids. Now, you can see at the back of me there are different huge rocks or huge blocks. These blocks are called in Arabic mastabas. They were hewn together, rockery, and they were put in such a place that you can't even slide a laser blade, between them. So this is there are 3 pyramids around, this space in Giza. One was built by the pharaoh Khufu, one was built by Menkura and Khafre, and the pharaoh, Khafre or Khafre. And behind me, just by Khufu's pyramid, 3 pyramids of the queen, which I understand is from the 4th dynasty. This one would have to check out. Of course, some of them have fallen into disrepair. They are smaller, than the pyramid of Khufu and his son Khafre. Now, the Khufu pyramid and that of Khafre are the same height, although the father's pyramid was bigger than that of the son. Now, one of the things you need to remember about the pyramids is that as the older the dynasty, the better the pyramid, or the better the funeral temples, or the better the building. As you get closer, they get more complicated and more difficult or less attractive. And this behind me is the so-called Sphinx. The Greeks called it the Sphinx. The African people called it Har-em-Eket, the god of the horizon. Now, for thousands of years, this baffled travelers, almost every traveler to ancient Egypt, from Herodotus, to Strabo, to Titus, to all the travelers that came to ancient Egypt, this was be their first step, the Sphinx of Giza, or the Har-em-Eket, which means the god of the horizon. It is said that it was done in that the head was done in the shape of the pharaoh Khafre, although the age of the Sphinx is older than the pharaoh, Khafre. Now, you notice, the Sphinx has no nose because the nose was hit by Napoleon, dynamited by Napoleon when he entered Egypt in the later part of the 18th century, and he fought a long battle with the Mamluks. Now, that nose is in the British Museum, but Napoleon fired 21 guns, and that's where we get the 21 gun salute when a king or a president is coming into a country. Now, the Har-em-Eket is the man with the body of a lion. That means that you are born with animalistic tendencies, and you are supposed to outgrow them by rising to the top of the pyramid, of course in nearness to the creator and imitating the creator in creativity. So the concept of animal or Egyptian people being obsessed by different animals comes, of course, from their lineage from the south. And here you find that with the totemism, which was one of the characteristics that was adopted from the Nile Valley, is that each clan had a totem. Each of these clans represented different qualities that was definitely carried over by the ancient Egyptians, onto this high civilization of the Nile Valley. So the hard making, much as it's a man with a lion's body, is also a link between the culture that starts from the south and rising, following the Nile, onto Sudan and onto ancient Egypt. And TV Africa has a lot of exciting things for you. You have nothing. You have not seen nothing yet. Oh, you think you have seen it all? You think you are educated now? You think all the secrets are over? You know Jabulon now. You know Barthome. You know the secret societies. I have had everything. I am educated now. Even the Freemasons, even though it is a secret organization, even though if I know what God they worship the god Barthome, that they worship Jabulon, then what else do I need to know? I have heard from TV Africa that the Queen is actually the head of the entire world Masonry, known as the Grand Patroness of the world Masonry. I know that in Westminster there is a new lodge, a new world lodge, I think, a grand patroness. Once I know the grand patroness of the world Masonry, grand patroness. What else? I'm going to turn away. I don't want to know more. No. Because I already know that in Westminster there is a new Masonic lodge, sometimes known as a New Welcome Masonic Lodge. And inside Westminster, where the world's leaders and parliamentarians of Britain meet to wear hand gloves, white hand gloves, ceremonial dagger, and perform those bloodthirsty rituals, and wear a skirt, that skirt that the Masons wear, hiding their genitalia, because in Grand Masonry, the missing part of their genitalia is known as the missing principle of light. That's why they wear skirt, to protect it. But there is a story, and that story TV Africa will tell.
The Order of the Skull and Bones is located on the campus of Yale University. John Pogue is a Yale graduate and the producer of a Hollywood movie called Skulls, based on the chilling radiation night. Chosen members enter a windowless hall on campus where they strip naked and lay inside a coffin. During the rituals, they reveal their innermost secrets, including the intimate details of their sexual history. Senior bonesmen dressed in robes chant over the new member in a symbolic death and rebirth ceremony. Each new member takes a vow, swearing a lifetime commitment to the Brotherhood, secretly known as the Brotherhood of Death. The crossed bones symbolize the right of new members to double-cross and use any means possible on their rise to power. America's big money families formed the fraternity's inner power circle. Taft, Russell, Schiff, Harriman, Bush, Warburg, Guggenheim, Rockefeller, Stimson, Weyerhaeuser, Vanderbilt, Goodyear, and Pillsbury were all members. These families intermarried over the generations to form America's big money aristocracy.
So, brothers and sisters, I am telling you that even the painful journeys of slavery, to revisit it, to show you how it was done, to show you how you were turned into a free and thoughtful and righteous man into a timid, quaking black person, giving up your name, giving up your morals, giving up your ways, timid and afraid. We shall go into that. We shall go into how a black woman moved from a position of dignity to a position of a sex slave in a sex farm. How young boys were put in a sex farm, transferred from these sex farms. And inside the sex farms, they put a black maid to come and tell them that when the master comes to hunt amongst them as young boys or young girls, they should keep laughing and they should keep dancing because he's their master, and whatever sickness is going to do with them, it is okay. We shall talk about how homosexuality was introduced into the African society by the slave masters, the masters who worship the devil himself, by these Europeans, by these slave masters who picked one man amongst us and put him amongst us to soften us, to tell us that the pain was okay, and how that same person has now been introduced in music. Because in music you see all these musicians and they have black women and black men but dancing naked around them. The same plantation, when slavery ended, when the slaves ended slavery, it didn't end. Slavery is now in effect on the continent. It is cheaper, it is more expensive to keep a slave in America growing cotton. It is cheaper here. And white people know it. White people know that if you have a slave in Gabon, if you have a slave in Uganda, if you have a slave in Kenya, he sleeps in his own shack. If he sleeps hungry, he doesn't have anybody to blame. He will work for $1, growing food that white people eat. It is TV Africa, where you are learning the basic principle of economics. The basic economics being defined as a productive capability of a system to make it work for you. If it doesn't work for you, it is not economics. In Africa, we grow food we don't eat. We grow cotton and it is wrong. We grow coffee and it is wrong. We grow tobacco and it is very wrong. And we grow it for people who are interested in one thing and one thing about us, our death and destruction. We have already shown you that most of these organizations, like Planned Parenthood, their aim is the total destruction of black people. They are obsessed with having few black people. Imagine somebody coming into your home, looking at your children, and instead of saying, Mukasa is a wonderful boy, and Odongo is really brilliant, and look at Kamajong, how he's really so beautiful, and Amoti is cute, and Atenyi is wonderful, and look, Tumushabe is a rhythm of total brightness. Brilliant comes from brightness, comes from light. One of the terms and expressions that Freemasons use. Freemasons, you have to understand, they are ruling the world right now. The Illuminati and the Freemasons and the Skull and Bones Society, what you call international organizations, is just them. But I was saying, imagine a person comes into your home and instead of appreciating your children, instead looks at you in the face and say, "Phew, you children are too many. There are just too many of them and you need to reduce them." And you say, why? He says, well, you won't have enough food to feed them. And you say, but they are my children, I'll find something to feed them. And he said, no, you have to reduce them now, and if you don't, you'll get in trouble with me. TV Africa has been giving you life-saving information. One of those life-saving information is what we have been reporting on HIV and AIDS. Whereas everybody tells you to go for a test, we have been telling you that that test is a problem. It is inaccurate. It is not accurate test. It is not a test for HIV. It is a test for antibodies. Antibodies are a good thing. You are supposed to smile and hold a party if you have antibodies, because antibodies confirm that you have immunity. They do not deny Antibodies don't prove you have a disease. Antibodies say you were attacked by something and we defeated it. They write on the insert that come with those tests, do not use this to test for HIV, to confirm the presence of HIV 1 and 2 or antibodies against it. They write it. It is not. On TV Africa, we have shown you Dr. Kerry Morris, who invented the PCR, the Palmer's chain reaction, telling you it's a DNA-based test and telling you to use DNA to test for HIV, to use PCR to test for HIV is a diabolic hoax.
If they didn't allow them to charge so much for it, I think there'll be a lot less use of it. You know, it's just like in political scandals. Follow the money trail. Figure out who's getting paid for this. Who's getting the money for those Western blots. There's your person who's going to always come down on the side of, yeah, you got a confirmatory Western blots, they call it. You know, do a confirmatory Western blot. Well, let's see. And those things are so hokey, it's just ridiculous. I didn't know they don't even do them in England anymore.
No,
but
not since 1992.
It's totally, and ask a doctor how it works. The doctor who prescribes, he says, got to have a Western blot to confirm this ELISA positive thing. How does that work, doctor? Sir, what are they now measuring about me that's different from what they measured with the ELISA test? He wouldn't know. He's not got any idea. I'll bet you there's scarcely 50 physicians in this country that know what a Western blot really is. They know when to order it, and they know they get a kickback on it probably. They make some money from having to take the blood or whatever, and they make money by prescribing AZT. They get money every time they turn around. They get money.
On TV Africa, we've brought you all the experts, including Lac Montagnier, the man who first discovered HIV, looking at you right in the face in front of the camera and saying, HIV's contribution to AIDS is benign.
In 1983, Dr. Luc Montagnier and his team of researchers identified what they thought might be the cause of AIDS.
I really was excited because we knew it was a new type of virus, not shown before in men, and very likely to be the cause of AIDS. Of course, at that time we didn't have the full proof it was the cause of AIDS. I'm a promoter of the role of cofactors in AIDS. The new generation of antiretroviral drugs are less toxic. They can be more tolerated. But for how long? I agree. We cannot give a treatment for life. It's not like insulin. You know, it's something which is toxic.
What do you want us to do? If you should be told you are HIV positive, don't quake. Don't panic, because whether they tell you are positive or negative is the same thing. The test is inaccurate. They have no test for HIV. And there are 72 other conditions that can give you a positive test on that strip of paper where they just put your blood and watch it run. Oh, TV Africa. TV Africa.
There's also data from a number of hospitals in the US, which was published in 1988, where they tested nearly 90,000 blood samples anonymously on hospital patients. And these patients were selected to have no risks for HIV infection or AIDS. In some of the hospitals, they found 25% of men were HIV positive on the Western blot, the most specific test, and they found that 8% of women were HIV positive on the Western blot. I mean, this should lead one to question again, how do that many people who have no risk for HIV or AIDS get to have that many HIV antibodies?
Being HIV positive puts you in a precarious position where your health can be judged in a way that no one else's health is judged. And when you're a woman and you're pregnant or you have a family, it presents a danger. When I was pregnant and I did not want to go on the drug therapies, had I had any of the problems that my HIV negative pregnant friends had, such as chronic yeast infections or even toxoplasmosis, I would have been considered having AIDS, and I would have been considered more irresponsible than I already was for having ever gotten pregnant in the first place, and I would have decidedly risked having my son taken away from me at birth.
There's so many factors that can even cause a false positive, from flu vaccine to herpes or venereal disease, alcoholism, and you can be told that you're positive and not even be positive, whatever that means. I have friends who've been through this. A friend who went through years of being told he was positive till he went to another doctor who said, we're not finding anything, we're using all of our tests. And now he's confused and goes back and forth. There's no oversight in any of this, but they're terrorizing and ripping people's lives apart with unsupportable data.
Nobody can find free infectious HIV virus in a human being. That is why they have to resort to looking for antibodies to HIV in a person. That is one of the biggest flaws in the HIV hypothesis, that antibodies, which are a sign of immunity, you should be happy that you have antibodies. It means that you are now immune. And yet with AIDS, we have antibodies as a predictor or an indicator of AIDS and future death. That doesn't make any sense to me.
In different countries or institutions or laboratories around the world, what is criteria used to define a positive Western blot test vary considerably. That is, the number of bands required vary considerably. And here we have on the chart several different institutions: France, United Kingdom, Germany, some American institutions, the US Red Cross, the FDA. And you can see by looking at this chart that just about every lane is different. Now this has some interesting implications. For instance, in Australia, which is the second lane, you need 4 bands to be deemed HIV infected. In fact, Australia is probably the hardest country, in fact, in which to be deemed HIV positive. But in other parts of the world, you don't need that many bands. In Africa, you need 2. In some parts of America, you need 2. In some parts of America, you need 3. And in the MAC study, the multi-centre AIDS cohort study, up till 1990, just 1 band was considered sufficient to diagnose a gay man HIV infected.
When you have indeterminate bands and you don't have the full array of them, then there's obviously the iffy situation where you need to repeat it. But I don't think that there's anything wrong with different countries having different criteria, because the different criteria are only really for that small group of patients that come in the indeterminate level. When a Western blot is really positive, it hits you like a truck. It's only for that little indeterminate group that you have to be concerned.
This means, in theory at least, that if you were tested in New York today, then flew to Australia, and you had 3 bands in New York, you would not be positive in Australia, but you would be positive in New York City. Now, a virus cannot behave in this manner, and this is what has led us to hypothesise that there is no proof that any person with a positive antibody test, no matter how defined, is in fact infected with this so-called lethal retrovirus.
Since '92, there is no Western blot in Great Britain, because they saw it's a waste of money, It's the same principle.
Well, the bulk of the world uses it. If some technology comes across better, I'd be the first to say, do it. I mean, obviously. The Western blot's a valuable test as defining the proteins that you have antibodies to. Everybody uses it experimentally, and most people use it clinically around the world. Not maybe Britain doesn't use it. Maybe there are 2 countries that found a better way. God bless them.
The only clinical picture which the different risk groups have in common, that's hepatitis. You don't find a single biopsy confirmed PCP in hemophiliacs or in drug abusers other than homosexuals. But they overcame the problem that every gay person who admits drug abuse would be in the list of drug abusers, so they have some PCP cases. But a drug abuser or a drug abusing women not using poppers never comes down with PCP. They have the definition for women with AIDS, that's candida of the throat, right? Not of the mouth, but even when a medical doctor sees a little bit candida in the mouth, they would say it's an AIDS case. even when tested negative. That's also very, very important, that you don't need a positive test. Even a negative test would declare you to be an AIDS case when they confirm that you have a PCP.
For more than 15 years, one of the indicators to determine do you have AIDS, how sick are you with AIDS, is your T-cell count. We've been led to believe that by measuring our T4 and 8 helper cells that it will indicate how far along we are in our progression. The lower the T-cell count, the more sick you are.
Now, the CDC muddied the waters somewhat in 1993 when it added a new condition to the definition of AIDS, which was T-cell counts under 200. Now, since 1993, if you have an HIV antibody test that's positive and a T-cell count under 200, you can be considered an AIDS patient. Now, this is quite an innovation. As of last year, according to the CDC's own statistics, 65% of patients who've been diagnosed with AIDS in the calendar year of 1997 were diagnosed solely on the basis of having a positive HIV test and low T-cell counts. Not on the basis of a disease like pneumocystis pneumonia or Kaposi sarcoma. They were diagnosed with a deadly illness on the basis of 2 laboratory findings, an HIV positive test and a T-cell count under 200. The problem with a T-cell count under 200 is that it's never been shown to be a valid indicator of illness. In the only study of its kind of HIV negative healthy individuals that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1992, T-cell counts of these individuals were found to range from 237 to 1,817. So suddenly we're looking at a 200 T-cell count as something on the low end of normal. But if you're HIV positive and you have a T-cell count under 200, just once, then you're considered a victim of a deadly disease and considered an AIDS statistic. Suddenly a whole lot of people can qualify for an AIDS diagnosis on that basis and for a lot of government funding.
Certainly, T4 decrease cannot be considered the hallmark of AIDS because it appears in many patients who never develop AIDS. In fact, all you have to do to have a decreased T4 cell is to go on the beach and lie there for a few hours. And if you measure your T4 cells, more than likely they will be very low.
It's not possible to measure the strength of your immune system using the blood. It makes no sense because only 2% of those white blood cells or lymphocytes said to be responsible for immune functions are in the blood. All the others are in the tissues where they have to do their work. It's like looking outside to the street, onto the street, and counting the police cars coming by every day, and you would count 10 usually, but suddenly only 3, and then you would say 7 of those policemen, caught up or were killed by the virus mafia in the Bronx. But that's completely mistaken. They are probably somewhere else to do their job, and that's how it works in our body.
Part of the fear that accompanies this issue is if I do nothing to fight my HIV, something will happen in the future. The HIV will come and get me 10 or 15 years down the line. This is what we're told to believe. That sort of fear is very powerful. It makes people who stop taking the drugs go back on the drugs, even if they're doing fine, but their surrogate markers change, the viral load and T-cell counts change. That's another part of the fear. That's psychological terror, plain and simple. Nothing else is behind those markers. It's a numbers game that doctors play, knowingly or not, with their patients. And their patients buy into that for the most part and are led by this fear.
I don't think there are any infectious diseases in which everybody who's infected gets sick. I mean, usually it's the minority of people. Poliovirus used to infect many, many, many more people than became paralyzed. Hepatitis B affects many people. They don't even know it. They get better and they're fine. It kills other people. So it's not so straightforward. And the notion that HIV, almost everybody dies from it, would make it, in my more traditional view, a very radical
kind of way out notion, which is coming from our established medical profession, who one would have thought would have been a little bit more conservative.
To say that all of you have to die, how unfair, how unjust, how cruel. They went too far, you know, declaring an absolute death sentence in AIDS. From the first 5 cases, only 2 died, the 3 survived. So that's very clear that they built up a system of belief, because they were misusing the gay scene of New York City from 78 till 80 in order to isolate the hepatitis B vaccine out of them. So they perfectly knew already what kind of proteins and what kind of anti-proteins, the antibodies, they have inside their blood and inside their body.
You have been asking me so many questions, and I want to take time to answer them, if I can remember. But if I don't remember, please, 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 write to us. The address is on the screen. Text us, text a message to us. Do a video question and send it to Kiurankuba. I will answer whatever question. Those questions you've been asking over and over. Will TV Africa cover the whole continent? Yes. But what we are doing now is just getting our house in order, building a television center, the largest television center in East Africa. Zimbabwe has a beautiful television center. SABC in South Africa has a beautiful television center. But for us, we are building a center that has a bookshop and a library and studios for animation and studios for recording and a concert hall and a cafe, a whole total African experience. On top over here, with some of the most spectacular view in Kampala. So yes, that is our intention. But we have to train people to report as Africans. Right now, we are launching a couple of programs that you are going to be seeing soon, including a travel program. You want to know how to get into Zambia, don't you? If you travel by road, or if you travel by plane. You want to know, what about Congo? Can you really go to Congo? What about Sudan? What are the restaurants like? What about the food? What about Ethiopia? You want to know, if I was traveling to Ethiopia, what would happen? We shall bring you that right onto the screen in our famous travel program. So, you don't know what is coming to you. You don't know what you have bought into. But let me now attempt to answer some of the questions that I remember. There was a question asked by a Christian saying, if we are saying that humanity evolved, that we as human beings evolved from chimpanzee, does that mean, therefore, that God did not create the world? So, the answer is, there is something in there for everyone. Because you can argue that it was God that created the chimpanzee. It was God that created the mutations, the laws of mutation that he put in the human body. It was God that created the anemones, the jellyfish. It was God that created the prosimian. It was God that brought into account the tectonic movement that split the earth. You could make that argument. No, it does not argue that. Religion is belief-based. It is a faith-based system. You have to believe something. Religion is not history. No. When they say Jesus walked on water, it doesn't literally mean that he really put 1 foot on water and then he put another foot. No. They are talking about Jesus navigating the difficult terrain that was equivalent to really walking on water. When he resurrects Lazarus, what we are doing on Television Africa is to resurrect you. We have learned a leaf from Jesus, about resurrection. You want resurrection? I give you resurrection. So that's what it means. It means that history shows us the process under which humans reach the stage where we are. And obviously I've told you that chimpanzee's DNA is close to that of a human being. We differ from the chimpanzee's DNA by 1 to 2%. In fact, 1.5%. So that is the closeness. And we have moved a long way from the chimpanzee to Homo sapien, modern man. But I am not telling you as a Christian, I am not telling you as a Muslim, that does not mean that the Creator did not create you. But religion is about faith. Religion is about belief. And religion is not about history. Now, the question, another question the brother asked, is the question about the Piltdown. That when I was speaking in one of my lectures to the police in Masindi, I talked about how white people falsified a fossil to mislead the scientific world that they were the first people to populate the world. I believe I repeated this in my lecture at York College in New York and the lecture that I gave in Holland at Eindhoven. Now, a documentary on the WAHENE MESU series talking about the Piltdown is about to air on TV Africa. And it goes in details on how it was done and how the discovery was made. So I would request you, brother, to hold on because I'm going to answer that question of the Piltdown in detail. A lot of you have been commenting on Göttingen University in 1776. 1776. 1776. 1776. Göttingen University. 1776 is also the year when the Freemasons were founded. The Illuminati in Bavaria. And Göttingen is not far. 1776 is when the Masons decided, let us bury Africa at the bottom of the world heap, and there never to rise again. 1776 was when the Germans decided that they would take over the world as the Illuminati, illuminated ones, those who can see in the dark. That is why when they go to the Bohemian Grove, when the world leaders gather in Bohemian Grove, chase each other naked in the forest, urinate on each other, and wear robes of the Ku Klux Klan, they worship an owl. An owl. Because an owl can see in the dark. As I was speaking about Göttingen, I remembered 1776. It is also the year that is on the $1 bill. When the Freemason says our enterprise was successful. Enterprise being successful, meaning Africa can now go at the bottom of the world society. 1776. Woo! Yes, but Göttingen, yes, is where Germans, Winkelmann, Blumenbach, Friedrich von Humboldt, at a university called Göttingen, where they decided to say, let us bury Africa at the bottom of the world heap. And the question that was asked also suggested that why can't we resurrect Africa? And that is what TV Africa is doing. But also, when you are in your university, ensure that you take two sides of notes. The notes that will enable your teacher to help you pass your exams by repeating the junk that they push in your schools, but also take notice of what will make you sane. That's 1776. It's on the dollar bill. On that dollar bill, there is a pyramid. That is an Egyptian pyramid with 13 steps. And the queen is crowned on a 13 steps pyramid, on a step pyramid, or 5 steps, I think. And that, on top of that pyramid, is the all-seeing eye of Osiris, the Egyptian god. And on top of Osiris, on the dollar bill, they say, Anut Tawi, our enterprise is successful. And below, they say, Nuzavo Sacrorum, new order of all ages, or new order of the world ages, a new world order. Now, that 1776 was also when Africa was buried, when they decided that they shall teach that humanity did not start at the foothills of the mountains of the moon, in the land of the gods, as it was done, as it was understood by the ancients from ancient Egypt and ancient Ethiopia, as it was understood that humanity started from where we are. That was the knowledge, that was the secret, that was what was in existence from time that humanity started at the foothills of the mountains of the moon, in the land of the gods, at the equator, at the center of the earth. In fact, there is a place in Mubende, which I have seen in Mubende, which is almost equivalent to the end of the world, where God would have stood to be able, to create the world. Where God would have stood to be able to create the world. Those of you who are asking about creation. But really, it is here at the equator. It is here where the world was created. It is here where the world was divided. And I tell you, it is here where the revival of African people will be organized. It is here where the revival of African people, the rise of African people will be redone. So this is the equator that separates the north and the south. Anything here will be very dark. Anything away from here, as you move away from the equator, anything going north will become dark, will become light. Anything going south will also become light. So, Logan's law means that humanity born around the tropics was necessarily pigmented and black. So that's why when you go to the North Pole or the polar ice cap, everything that you find there is light or is white. Now, Gloger's law is related to another law, which is known as Mendel's law. Gregor Mendel, born in 1822, was the father of genetics. When he was young, he didn't have enough money to take him to school, so he went to a monastery of Augustine. Augustine, one of the great founders of the Catholic Church, he wrote the canonical laws that govern the Catholic Church. He lived in Carthage, and he was African. Now, the monks that follow Augustine are known as Augustine monks. So Gregor Mendel went to Augustine monks, and he learned to exercise with plants. And he said, at the end of his different experiments, Mendel concluded that if we had begun with white people, we would never have got black people. Because at the time, the dominant racism in Europe taught that humanity started in Europe, and the European was a core seed population. And actually, anybody who moved from Europe to populate Asia or Europe or the Americas, became a degenerate form of a white person. So that if humanity go to Africa, they became either too dark, or too short, or too dumb, or too tall, or too long. In other words, they became distorted. But Mendel was to prove all this wrong. Mendel established, through different experiments with plants and chickens and other, species, that a mother plant will pass on genes in different sequence, mainly 50% of the genes to the child. And therefore, that a recessive can never produce a dominant, but a dominant can produce a recessive. Now, Mendel's ideas were quite breathtaking because the scientific community ignored him for 32 years. But afterwards, they all had to accept the fact that humanity started with dark-skinned people, and over a period of time from 5.5 million years to 20,000 years, the African Cro-Magnon that lived in Europe was to mutate into the European Cro-Magnon, who is the progenitor of the white race. That was at the time when European domination over the world was very strong. Europeans were gobbling up cultures, were destroying civilizations. So the last thing they wanted to accept was to say that somebody other than the European was really the source of all races. So actually the term race is a sociological construct. It has no meaning in biology. Race means a group of organisms that interbreed and reproduce within themselves over a long period of time, normally 400 years. And humankind is not like that. There is only, as it is said, one race. And that race began from the original peoples of the world, the black people, about 5 to 7 million years ago, here at the foothills of the mountains of the moon, in the land of the gods, and at this source, at the equator. From here we must rise. From here we must go up. From here we must reach the sky. From here we must recreate the high technical civilization. So we must say, let us resurrect Africa from the bottom of the world heap and put it at the top, there never to fall again. Let us scale down the mountain to the Rwenzori and the Kilimanjaro and the Kenya, and let us teach that humanity started at the foothills of the mountains of the moon. And the people who emerged from Noah's Ark were black people. And the people who built Noah's Ark were black people. And the people who watched Noah's Ark were black people. Let us not have pseudo-scientific theories, but let us recreate the high technical civilization of African people.